The amber light of a setting sun used to paint the old Victorian house in a warmth it never truly held for me. I remember standing at the edge of its sprawling lawn, a child of its blood yet a stranger at its door, listening to the cacophony of laughter and clinking porcelain that spilled from the dining room. That sound was a fortress, and I was forever on the wrong side of the walls. They said the table was for family. Their definition a weapon forged in quiet disdain and polished with tradition. There were never shouts, only the genteel violence of a place setting removed, a chair subtly taken, the cool, corrective smile from my aunt that said, "You belong over there with the children." The sting was never in the words, but in the silence that followed them. A void where my name should have been. I carried that void for years, a cold emptiness in the pit of my being that their privileged glances and whispered judgments could never fill. They thought they had placed me on the periphery forever, a footnote in the family ledger. They never imagined that the footnote would one day foreclose on the entire story. The house that taught me I didn't belong was about to learn who its new master was. The memory of the banishment was not a sudden sharp fracture, but the slow sickening crack of ice giving way beneath your feet. You feel the shift, the groan of something fundamental breaking, long before the cold water swallows you whole. It was my grandfather's 80th birthday, an event of supposed unity, where the air itself was thick with the cloying perfume of peonies and pretense. The house, a grand, venerable old beast of timber and memory, had been polished to a high shine, every silver candlestick and mahogany surface gleaming under the warm artificial light of the chandelier. I had arrived clutching a bottle of his favorite, obscenely expensive single malt, a peace offering purchased with a week's wages, a tangible plea for a sliver of acceptance. The initial greetings were a masterclass in emotional sleight of hand. My aunt's brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes, my uncle's clap on the shoulder that felt more like a dismissal than a welcome, the chorus of "You're here" that hung in the air with the unspoken suffix. Finally, I navigated the crowded living room, a ghost at my own family's feast, the familiar ache of otherness settling deep in my bones. The moment of truth was announced not by a voice, but by the resonant, clear ping of a silver fork against a crystal flute. My uncle, the self-appointed patriarch in waiting, stood, his smile a bland, practiced gesture meant for the crowd. "Everyone, find your seats. The feast awaits," he boomed, his voice dripping with a jovial authority that brooked no dissent. A cheerful, chaotic scramble ensued, a well-rehearsed dance where everyone knew their part, their place. I moved with the current, drawn toward the great roaring heart of the home, the dining room. And there it stood, the table. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was an altar of lineage, a vast, dark ocean of polished oak, scarred and stained with the history of 100 such gatherings. The heirloom linen, the weighty, ornate silverware, the delicate china that had survived generations. It was all a stage set for a play in which I had never been granted a speaking role. I watched as my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, all slid effortlessly into their accustomed chairs, the sound of wood scraping softly on the Persian rug a symphony of belonging. I hovered near the archway, a ship waiting for permission to dock, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I scanned the table, my eyes desperately seeking an empty space, a gap in the familial fortress where I might insert myself. There was one, a single solitary chair, tucked between my grandfather and my cousin Michael. It felt like a sign, a tiny hopeful fissure in the wall. I took a tentative step forward, my hand already lifting, a greeting to my grandfather forming on my lips. It was then that my aunt materialized beside me, her movement silent and fluid, like a shark gliding through familiar waters. Her face was a mask of placid efficiency, but her eyes were hard, cold shards of flint. "Oh no, dear," she said, her voice a low, honeyed whisper meant only for my ears, yet it seemed to slice through the room's chatter. Her hand, dry and firm, closed around my forearm, not with violence, but with an absolute unassailable finality. It was a grip that halted worlds. She didn't look at me as she spoke. Her gaze was fixed on some point across the room, as if addressing me directly was beneath her. "We've set a lovely little spot for you just over here. It's much cozier." With a gentle, inexorable pressure, she began to steer me away from the light and warmth of the main table, away from the deep, rumbling laughter of the men and the sharp, tinkling laughter of the women. She guided me, a polite but firm escort, toward the periphery of the room, to a small circular table usually reserved for puzzles or decorative displays. It was dwarfed by the grandeur of the main one, a pathetic satellite to a brilliant planet. On it sat a simple checkered cloth, a paper napkin, and a single sturdy unadorned water glass, a stark utilitarian contrast to the linen and crystal a mere 10 feet away. Two of my young cousins, no older than 7 and 9, already fidgeted there, their faces etched with boredom. "You can keep an eye on the little ones," my aunt declared, her tone suggesting this was a privilege, a responsibility, and not the profound and public demotion it so clearly was. "They'll so enjoy your company." The walk to that little table was the longest of my life. Every eye in the room was upon me, though they all pretended not to see. I felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical blow, a heat that scalded my cheeks and the back of my neck. I could hear the conversation stutter and then hastily resume. A wave of awkward silence followed by a forced, louder joviality meant to cover the sound of my social execution. The laughter from the main table now sounded different, not joyful but mocking, a roaring fire from which I had been permanently excluded. As I sank into the flimsy chair at the children's table, the world seemed to shrink and warp. The grand, detailed tapestry of the family dinner blurred into a watery impression, the voices melting into a meaningless hum. I was in a bell jar, separated from them by an invisible, unbreachable wall of their own making. I looked down at my hands, clenched into white-knuckled fists in my lap, and then at the simple childish plate before me. In that moment I was no longer a 24-year-old man. I was a child again, small, insignificant, and painfully, utterly alone, the message searing itself into my soul with the clarity of a brand. I was not one of them. I did not belong at the family table. The truth of it was not just in my aunt's words, but in the silence of everyone else who witnessed it and said nothing, the crushing weight of their collective, tacit approval of my exile. The humiliation of the children's table did not end with the scraping of chairs or the final, cloying bite of birthday cake. It festered. It became a low, constant hum in the background of my life, a dissonant chord that colored every subsequent interaction, every polite, empty phone call. For weeks I moved through my world in a state of numb detachment, the memory of their collective, silent approval of my exile playing on a loop in my mind. I had tried to rationalize it, to cloak it in the tattered garments of old family dynamics or my aunt's particular brand of cruelty, but the wound was too deep, too public. The carefully constructed dam of my composure, which had held for so long, was on the verge of a catastrophic failure, waiting only for the final precise tap to shatter it completely. That tap came a month later, on an otherwise unremarkable Sunday afternoon, under the guise of a casual family visit to collect a few forgotten boxes of my mother's things from the attic. The air in the old house was still and heavy with dust motes dancing in the slanted light, the quiet feeling like the calm before a storm. I moved through the familiar rooms, now feeling like a museum of my own alienation, each creak of the floorboard, a whisper of my unwelcome presence. The task was nearly complete, the past sealed in cardboard and tape, when my grandmother, a woman whose love I had never before questioned, called me into the formal living room, the sanctum sanctorum where the most prized family heirlooms were displayed under glass and lock. She stood before the tall mahogany curio cabinet, her slender age-spotted hands trembling slightly as she worked a small brass key into the lock. The click echoed in the silent room. "With your grandfather's birthday past," she began, her voice thin and reedy, yet carrying an unnerving formality, "it's time we started thinking about the future, about legacy." My heart, a traitorous thing, gave a single hard thump of hope. Was this it? An apology perhaps not in words but in action? A recognition, finally, that I was part of this lineage? She reached inside and carefully lifted out my great-grandmother's porcelain tea set. A thing of breathtaking fragility, each cup painted with tiny, impossible cornflowers and edged in a band of pure liquid gold. It was more than china. It was a symbol, a tangible thread connecting generations of women in our family. I had watched her polish it every Sunday of my childhood, her touch reverent, telling me stories of the strong, elegant woman who had poured tea from that very pot for governors and artists. I could feel the ghost of a smile touching my lips, a fragile budding thing. This was an heirloom of belonging. She turned, the teapot cradled in her hands like a holy relic, and her eyes, usually soft with a gentle confusion, were now sharp and painfully clear. "This set," she said, her gaze holding mine, "has always been meant for Sarah." The name hung in the air, sharp and final as a guillotine's blade. Zara, my cousin, my aunt's daughter, the golden child, whose place at the main table was as unquestioned as the rising sun. The fragile hope in my chest didn't just wither. It imploded, collapsing into a supernova of pure, silent agony. I could not speak. I could not breathe. It felt as though all the air had been sucked from the room, from the world. She continued, her words now falling on me like blows, each one landing with a sickening thud. She's getting married, you see, to that lovely boy from the Hamilton family. It's the right fit. It's what the set deserves. To be the centerpiece of a proper home, a proper family. And there it was. The unvarnished, devastating truth. I was not the right fit. My home, my future, my very bloodline was not proper. The children's table had not been an oversight or a simple cruelty. It was a reflection of my permanent, fundamental status in their eyes. I was an accessory, a supporting character in the grand narrative of their lives, worthy only of a paper napkin and a duty to mind the children, never of the gold-edged china, never of the legacy. I watched, paralyzed, as she placed the teapot back onto its velvet shelf, locking the cabinet with that same definitive click. The sound was the period at the end of the sentence of my exile. The warmth of the room turned to an Arctic chill. The dust motes now looked like ashes. I managed a nod, a tight, jerky movement that was the absolute limit of my physical control, and I walked out of that room, out of that house, on legs that felt made of wood and glass. I did not slam the door. I closed it with a soft, precise click, a mirror of the cabinet lock, a final quiet severance. The drive home was a blur of streaking lights and a roaring in my ears that drowned out the engine. But when I finally closed the door of my own small, silent apartment, leaning back against it as the last of my strength fled, the storm broke. It was not a storm of tears, not of ragged sobs or helpless rage. It was something colder, harder, more absolute. It was a glacial calm, a clarity so sharp it was painful. In the profound silence, I looked at my own reflection in the dark window, my face pale and stark in the glass. And in that moment, a vow was forged in the cold fire of that clarity. It was not a shouted oath, not a desperate promise. It was a quiet, solemn, and eternal covenant made between the person I was and the person I would have to become. They thought legacy was something you inherited, something you locked in a cabinet for the chosen few. They believed power was a seat at their table, a name on a guest list, a piece of gilded porcelain. They were wrong. I would not fight for a chair at their table. I would not beg for a chip of their painted china. I would build my own table, my own legacy from the ground up. And I would not rest until the very house that held their precious cabinet, their sacred table, their entire world of exclusion belonged to me. The vow once made became the cold, hard center of my being, a lodestone that recalibrated my entire existence. The raw, screaming pain of my grandmother's words first hardened into a shell of numb functionality, and then slowly transmuted into a different substance altogether, fuel. The memory of the children's table, the click of the locked cabinet, the sight of my own pale, devastated face in the dark window, these were no longer wounds to be nursed, but blueprints for a reckoning. I understood with a chilling and absolute clarity that the currency of their world was not love or loyalty, but cold, hard capital. They measured a person's worth by the cut of their suit, the prestige of their address, the weight of their portfolio. To ever stand as their equal, I would have to master that currency, and then I would have to bankrupt them. The life I had known was systematically dismantled. My comfortable, cluttered apartment was exchanged for a single Spartan room in a house shared with 3 strangers, its thin walls and lumpy mattress, a constant physical reminder of my purpose. Every saved dollar was a brick I was laying. My social life evaporated, not with a bang, but with a series of polite, distant refusals. Friends' voices on the phone grew concerned, then faint, and then fell silent. I became a ghost in my own city, moving through the world with a singular, obsessive focus. My days bled into nights at the office, the blue glow of my computer screen the only constant light, the hum of the server room my only music. I took on projects no one else wanted, the dry, complex analyses of failing businesses and market collapses. I learned to dissect financial ruin, to trace the elegant, fatal cracks in an empire's foundation, and in doing so, I began to understand the architecture of power. There was a profound, grinding loneliness to this ascent, A silence so deep it became a presence in itself. I would eat cold takeout at my desk, watching the city lights twinkle below, each one a window into a life of connection and warmth from which I had voluntarily exiled myself. Holidays came and went, marked only by the increased quiet in the office building. A Christmas Eve found me alone, the hollow echo of my footsteps in the vacant corridor the only carol I heard. Through the large window, I could see the warm, golden squares of other offices where parties were underway. Hear the faint, muffled peal of laughter that seeped through the walls. I stood there in the dark, my hand resting on the cold glass, and let the memory of my family's own lavish, exclusionary Christmas dinners wash over me. The scent of pine and roasting meat, the clatter of the fine china I was not allowed to touch. The ache was a physical weight in my chest, a pull to surrender, to call, to apologize for crimes I didn't commit just to hear a familiar voice. But then I would see it again. My aunt's placid, dismissive smile, my grandmother's hands locking the cabinet away. The ache would then crystallize, not into self-pity but into resolve. The loneliness was not an enemy. It was the refining fire. Every missed party, every silent evening, every birthday spent with only a spreadsheet for company was another layer of the old, vulnerable self being burned away, leaving behind something stronger, sharper, and utterly relentless. The work itself was a brutal education. I lived in the trenches of high finance, in the cold, hard numbers that underpinned the genteel world my family so admired. I saw old money like theirs become lazy and entitled, propped up by reputation and leverage, blind to the shifting tides. I, on the other hand, had no reputation to protect, no legacy to uphold. I had only hunger and a flawless, unforgiving memory. I learned to move money like a general moving troops with strategy, patience, and a willingness to be ruthless. A lucky break wasn't a matter of fate. It was the inevitable result of 1,000 previous unseen efforts. A complex deal that would make my name and secure my first real capital was a week-long siege of sleepless nights, of surviving on black coffee and a terrifying, exhilarating clarity that came only when every other comfort has been stripped away. The moment of victory, when the final signature was scrawled and the numbers flashed across the screen, confirming a profit so vast it was an abstract concept, brought no shout of triumph. I simply leaned back in my chair, the leather groaning in the pre-dawn silence, and felt nothing but a cold, deep satisfaction. I looked at the number, a string of digits that represented power, and then I looked at the faded mental photograph of the family table. The two were now inextricably linked. This was not wealth for a lavish life or a quiet retirement. It was a war chest. Every dollar was a soldier, and I was their general preparing for the final decisive campaign. The long, silent nights, the grinding sacrifices, the profound isolation. They had not broken me. They had forged me. The ghost they had banished to the children's table was now a specter of immense and gathering force, moving silently in the shadows of their world, waiting for the perfect moment to step into the light and claim what was now, by every right I had purchased with my own soul, mine. The intelligence did not arrive with a dramatic flourish or a vengeful fanfare. It came, as the most potent information often does, through the cold, sterile channels of professional disinterest. I was seated in a conference room that was all glass and polished steel, high above the city, the world reduced to a geometric grid of power and ambition. The murmur of the meeting was a low, professional hum, a discussion of portfolios and emerging markets, a language I now spoke with the fluency of a native. My phone, face up on the table, lit up with a notification. Not a text, but an automated alert from a proprietary financial tracking system I had built and refined over years. A digital bloodhound trained to sniff out the specific scent of one family's fiscal decay. It was a system designed for cold, hard data, but the name that flashed on the screen, the holding company that was a thin veneer for the family estate, sent a jolt through me that was anything but dispassionate. The alert was simple, devastating. A flag for potential distressed asset liquidation. My heart did not leap. It seemed to stop entirely, crystallizing into a perfect, frozen diamond of focus. I excused myself from the meeting with a calm I did not feel, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's-eye view of the city. The world outside, once a place of my own exile, now seemed to hold its breath with me. Alone in my office, with the door closed and the city sprawled beneath me like a map of possibilities, I began to dig. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Not with frantic energy, but with the precise surgical movements of a master. I pulled up financial statements, tax liens, property records, the dry, unemotional autopsy of a dying dream. The numbers told a story of staggering, silent collapse. The Grand Victorian, that monument to their superiority, was an anchor dragging them all down. Decades of leveraged living, of using the house as collateral for failed business ventures and lavish lifestyles, had finally culminated in a perfect storm of debt. There were second and third mortgages, lines of credit stretched to their absolute limit, and a recent catastrophic failure of my uncle's investment firm that had necessitated a final, desperate bailout using the house as the last chip they had to play. They had tried to keep it quiet, of course, shrouding their failure in the same genteel secrecy they used for everything else. But numbers do not lie. They do not care about tradition or reputation. They were bleeding out, and the only thing of sufficient value left to staunch the flow was the very soul of their legacy. A cold, quiet fury began to burn within me. A clean, focused flame that was the opposite of the hot, messy pain of the past. This was not the schadenfreude of petty revenge. It was the profound, chilling realization of a prophecy fulfilling itself. They had worshipped at the altar of appearance, and now that altar was being repossessed. They had believed their name and their history were a shield against the realities of the world, and the world, in its immutable, impartial way, was proving them wrong. I could almost see it. The hushed, panicked conversations in that formal living room, the veneer of civility cracking under the weight of financial ruin. The same people who had once judged my worth by my place setting now facing the loss of the table itself. The irony was so perfect it was poetic. I leaned back, steepling my fingers, and watched the data scroll across my screen. A symphony of their demise. This was the opportunity. It was more than an opportunity. It was an inevitability. A destination I had been walking toward through every sleepless night and every sacrificed moment of joy. The house that had defined my lesser-than status was now a commodity, and I was the only one in the room with the capital and the clarity to purchase it. I would not swoop in like a predatory vulture. That was their style, not mine. I would be a ghost, a silent, anonymous entity working through shell companies and intermediaries they would never deign to notice. They would be dealing with a faceless trust, a corporate entity they would assume was some distant institutional investor, all the while never suspecting that the hand poised to catch their falling empire was the same one they had once pushed away from their table. The moment was here. The path to justice was no longer a dream forged in pain, but a transaction waiting to be executed. The day of the closing was not marked by a dramatic storm or a portentous sky, but by a day of such breathtaking, ordinary beauty it felt like a deliberate mockery of the gravity of the transaction about to take place. Sunlight, clean and golden, poured through the wall of windows in the lawyer's office, a sterile modern space in the heart of the city's financial district, a world away from the dusty, tradition-steeped air of the old Victorian. I had arrived early, dressed not in the armor of obvious wealth, but in the quiet, impeccable uniform of the truly powerful. A tailored, understated suit that spoke of confidence, not flash. I stood silently, looking down at the city, my hands clasped behind my back. There was no nervousness in me, only a profound, glacial calm. I had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the private theater of my mind, but the reality was far stranger, a dream made manifest. The door to the conference room opened, and I heard the familiar, clipped tones of my uncle's voice, followed by the softer, more anxious murmur of my aunt. They entered, their postures stiff with a brittle dignity, their faces etched with the strain of a humiliation they were desperately trying to conceal beneath a veneer of businesslike composure. They did not look at me, not truly. Their gaze swept over me, a peripheral figure in the room, another anonymous professional. To them, I was just the representative of the trust, the faceless entity that was their financial savior, a necessary evil to be endured. The lawyer, a man I had chosen for his discretion and his lack of connection to their social circle, began the proceedings in a dry, monotone recitation of legalities. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet despair. Documents were passed, pens were clicked. I watched their hands as they signed away their birthright. My uncle's grip was tight, white-knuckled, my aunt's signature a frantic, spidery scrawl. They were performing the last rites on their own legacy. When the final signature was scrawled and the last document notarized, a heavy silence fell upon the room, broken only by the soft rustle of papers being gathered. It was then that I moved. I turned from the window slowly, deliberately, and walked to the head of the polished conference table. The lawyer, following our prearranged script, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and slid the single most important document across the gleaming surface toward me. It was the deed. I did not look at it. I let my fingertips rest lightly upon its crisp surface, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of the house, the weight of 20 years of exile contained within it. My uncle finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary meeting mine. For a single suspended second there was only confusion. He saw a successful unknown woman, an adversary perhaps. And then the scales fell. I watched the journey of recognition traverse his face. A flicker of doubt, a dawning horror, and finally, a catastrophic gut-punching comprehension that drained the color from his cheeks. His mouth opened but no sound emerged. My aunt, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, followed his gaze. Her hand flew to her throat, a theatrical gesture of pure undiluted shock. The polite, professional mask she wore shattered, revealing the raw, terrified woman beneath. "You," she whispered, the word a choked exhalation. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the sterile light now feeling interrogating, exposing every line of their defeat. I let the silence stretch, let them drown in it, let them feel the full vertiginous scale of their miscalculation. This was not a moment for gloating words or theatrical pronouncements. The power had already transferred, as silent and absolute as the turning of a key in a lock. I finally picked up the deed, holding it not with triumph, but with a quiet, absolute possession. My voice, when it came, was low, measured, and carried in the tomb-like silence of the room with the resonance of a final judgment. "The trust thanks you for your cooperation," I began, my eyes holding my uncle's, seeing the ghost of every dismissive glance, every condescending smile reflected back at me in his stunned gaze. "The property transfer is complete. The keys." The lawyer, a master of his craft, produced the heavy brass key ring, the very same keys I had watched my grandfather polish a lifetime ago. He placed them in my outstretched palm. The cold, solid weight of them was the most real thing I had ever felt. I closed my fingers around them, the metal biting into my skin, a seal upon a covenant fulfilled. I looked from my uncle's ashen face to my aunt's wide, horrified eyes, and I offered them a small, cold smile that held no warmth, no forgiveness, only the simple, unassailable truth of the moment. I had not been given a seat at their table. So I had bought the house, and with it the table, the china, the very ground upon which their world was built. And as I turned and walked out of that room, the keys held securely in my hand, I left them sitting in the devastating quiet of the ruins they had made for themselves.